Hey everybody, looks like we are live on Facebook, so feel free to say hello in the chat on either Facebook or Zoom, and we'll get started shortly.
Oh, sure. Okay, we're going to be getting started shortly, so please do say hello in the chat. You can tell us where you're watching from, whether you've been to the Beaty Research Center or the Beaty Biodiversity Museum, and the chat will be where we're going to be collecting our questions. So go ahead and try that out if you like. Fort Moody, thanks, Natalie. Hey, Derek. Hi, Arlene. Thank you for coming in from Alberta. Okay. I think most people are in. Hi, Janice. Thank you for joining us from West Vancouver. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Let's go here. So welcome to our Beaty at Home. We have our Beaty at Home every Wednesday at 1 o'clock. And today we're talking about women in STEM. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody. So first of all, we have Dr. Diane Srivastava. She's a professor, and she's also the in the Department of Zoology, and also she's the director of the Canadian Institute of Ecology and Evolution. And we also have with us today Jen Barron, who is a PhD student in the Tree Ring Lab in the Faculty of Forestry. Kashifa is our host, Kashifa Hafiz, and she's a museum interpreter at the Beaty Biodiversity Museum, and I'm Nancy. I'm also an interpreter here. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the museum to get us started. And so where is the Beaty Biodiversity Museum? I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Musqueam people, and that we are sharing, we have the great privilege of using the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We've got the website here, which is a great place to learn more about that community. Over here, there's a picture of a map of where the Beaty Biodiversity Museum is. If you're looking for it, it's in the center of UBC and near some other museums across the way from the Pacific Museum of Earth, and also near the center where the Biosciences building is and the bookstore. If you're coming up to the building, this is what it looks like. We have this wonderful atrium that has the blue whale skeleton, or the largest animal ever. And if you can look through the glass here in this photograph, you can see the research center right behind it. That is the Beaty Research Center, and together with the museum, that makes the Beaty Biodiversity Center. Over 50 researchers working with that center, so and all sorts of topics, including ecology and evolution. And we're going just to have a look at the blue whale skeleton on the inside. And then when you come down this giant ramp, you actually get to where all the over 2.1 million specimens are. And they're actually in the same public space that the displays are. So you can see they're housed in these cabinets to save them for hopefully hundreds of years more, already gathering at UBC for the last 100 years. So they are divided into the 6 collections here: the tetrapod, the marine invertebrates, the herbarium, the entomological collection, the fish collection, and the fossil collection. And there's a map of the layout of the museum, just to give you an idea of what it looks like in here. And where there's our blue whale again. And we're going to be using the chat box again for gathering our questions. So please do feel free to type in your questions at any point. and we'll go ahead and ask those out loud during the session. So I'm going to let Kashfa take over. Thanks very much for joining us, everyone, and we'll get started. So Kashfa, I'm going to turn off my slides. There you go.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, Nancy. And thank you everybody for joining us today for our Beaty at Home. We have a really special presentation today. We have two wonderful women in STEM with us, and we're going to ask them all about their experiences. And I have some questions, but of course you can put your questions in the chat as well. And I just wanted to say that we're holding this today to commemorate the International Day of Women and Girls in STEM, which is organized by the United Nations. And it's tomorrow. It's on the 11th, but we're celebrating it today because we do our Beaty at Home on Wednesdays. And we know that there's still lots of barriers in the field of STEM for women and for minorities. So hopefully we can touch a little bit on that today as well. One of the statistics I saw on the UN website was that less than 30% of STEM researchers around the world today are women. So that's quite, still shows there's lots of work to be done. And just before we move on, STEM stands for science, technology, education, and mathematics. Sometimes people use STEAM to include arts as well, but we're going with STEM today. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Diane Srivastava and Jan Barron, who, as Nancy introduced, Diane is a professor in the Faculty of Zoology, also the director of the Canadian Institute of Ecology and Evolution, and Jan Barron is a graduate student in the Faculty of Forestry. So, hey guys, how are you doing? Awesome. Good. So this is what we'll do for every question. We'll sort of go back and forth. I'll say, I'll say, hey, Jen, do you want to take this first? Diane? So I guess we'll start with introductions. So tell us a little bit about who you are, what you study, and also a little bit about what you like to do when you're not a woman in STEM. So what you like to do in your free time. So maybe Jen, we can start with you.
Sure, yeah, okay. So hi, my name is Jen Barron. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences here at UBC. And I study largely wildfire and landscape change here. So although some of the work I've done in the past has been really broad ecological questions like invasive species, climate change, using a variety of tools for my PhD, I've really honed in on questions around wildfire, which is a really big issue in BC today and something that a lot of people have questions about, including particularly government and managers have a lot of questions about what we can do today to better manage wildfire. So what I try to do is relate changes in the landscape to factors related to wildfire to better understand why the wildfires of today, of 2017 and 2018, are so different than the ones of the past, the ones that we all remember from the decades before, and how those wildfires are different from the ones that happened thousands of years prior to that. So to do that, I use a bunch of different data sources like historic air photos, so black and white imagery from the 1950s, provincial fire records, and wildfire modeling to try to answer some of those questions. And in my free time, when I'm not studying wildfire, I like to do a lot of puzzles. I'm really into puzzles since quarantine, even though I'm not very good at them and they've taken me a long time to do. I also really like camping and rock climbing, and I love travel, especially in Latin America, although I haven't been able to do that in a little while now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jen. So I'll pass the question on to you, Diane.
Hi, everyone. I guess before I get started, one thing I'd like to know is if we have a number of children listening in, and if we do, I'll try to use words that are a bit more accessible. But what I do, well, I'm an ecologist. That means I study species and how they interact with each other and the ecosystem that they occur in. And I do most of my work in the tropics. So I work a lot with insects, especially aquatic insects. So the curious thing about the system I work in is you would think aquatic insects, you think like streams, lakes, those sorts of habitats. well, it turns out that in the tropics, there actually aren't a lot of, for example, lakes. It's never been glaciated. So it's not like here where the glaciers scoured out lakes. Actually, a lot of the water in the tropics are hanging up in the trees. They're captured by plants, especially these plants called bromeliads. You might know these plants as air plants, and probably you have eaten one of them fairly recently. So pineapples are in the bromeliad family. So you know how the top of a pineapple is kind of like this, tuft of this whorl of leaves. Imagine that whorl of leaves like sitting on a tree branch in the tropics, collecting water. So I study the aquatic insects that live in that habitat, because it turns out that this habitat represents liters upon liters of water in just a hectare of rainforest. So I'm kind of interested in studying them as little miniature worlds where I can do experiments. So the things I'm interested in is like, how do we maintain so many species in a community? Why don't they go extinct? The flip side of that is, why do they go extinct? Which, what is the role of change in habitats of forest fragmentation and things like climate change? And I guess my other hat is I direct this synthesis center. So I help scientists do big syntheses of large databases that they might pull together to find like general patterns. So I'm also pretty keen on data.
That's awesome. And Diane, what do you like to do in your free time?
Free time. I like to get out. I like to go canoeing and hiking and backcountry camping, cycling, geocaching. When it's rainy, I like to do some woodworking. So things like that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I did want to say that Natalie says that she does have her daughter listening. So we do have at least one young person in listening to this. Awesome. So you both of you have touched on your research. So I wanted to get a little bit more into that. So how did you end up in your field? What are some of your favorite parts of your research and just your general trajectory in science? So maybe Diane, you can start, and then Jen.
Sure. So I was always keen on being outdoors and exploring. I wanted, to grow up and be an explorer, I think, or an adventurer. But as also, my parents are both scientists, so I also got a lot of exposure to science as a kid. And these, I guess, strands coalesced in my undergraduate. After kind of being pulled between ecology and molecular biology for a while, I decided to go with ecology. I started working on lakes in Nova Scotia, which is where I grew up. But for my master's, I worked on Arctic ecology. So I worked near Churchill in a remote area of the subarctic, where we lived for 3 to 4 months of the year. And then for my PhD, I moved to England, and I worked in part in England and in part in Cameroon on insect ecology. And from there, I came to UBC. And I've been working ever since in the tropics. So I've kind of like hit a lot of the big biomes, I guess. And I've got this odd latitudinal gradient where I know a really species poor system, which is the Arctic, and an incredibly species rich system, which is the tropics. And my work is mainly now in Costa Rica and Brazil and a bit French Guiana.
Fantastic. And what about yourself, Jen?
I actually had kind of similar my childhood experiences, both my parents are also scientists. And I remember my dad in particular was a freshwater chemist, and he was really excited about science with me as a kid. Like I remember being in the bathtub experimenting with like the density of objects and like running around the house with pH strips, testing things and making like huge messes with experiments of things he'd bring home from work that he probably shouldn't have. And then I remember going into university knowing I should do science because I was good at it, but having no clue what I actually liked about it, just knowing that it was the thing I did best. And then it wasn't till later in my undergrad that I really found kind of this niche that was ecology that wasn't a very large program at my school. And so I wasn't really exposed to it as early on. And then once I found that, and particularly forest ecology, I kind of just clung to it and found everyone I could to work with that was doing it, which it was kind of a case of, because it wasn't a large department at the university, the university I did my undergraduate at is much more focused on like cellular systems and medical research. Once I found the people that I could do that kind of research with, I essentially just convinced them to let me do projects. And then I started becoming really interested in like large scale ecological questions like global change drivers like invasive species and climate change and disturbance factors like wind and fire. And the reason I came to UBC was because I had this really strong female mentor in my undergrad who suggested I come work with my current supervisor. And then now that I've kind of transitioned into wildfire research, something I really enjoy, but it also ties well into some of the other things I've done, and I can see myself working in this discipline in the future beyond my PhD.
That's fantastic. Thanks, thanks both of you for sharing. One thing that came up was that having exposure to science at a young age definitely does play a role in wanting to pursue that in the future, and that's very close to my heart as an educator who works with children. So we're celebrating women in STEM today and all week. So I wanted to touch a little bit on your personal experiences being a woman in STEM. There's probably some challenges that come along the way, perhaps some successes and some positive things. So I wanted to open that question up to both of you. So Jen, maybe we'll get started with you first.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so I guess one of the strongest influences and most positive influences I've had as a woman in STEM has been through female mentorship. I mean, even when I was young, my mother was the most educated one in the household and was incredibly supportive of like right to education, regardless of cost, and that it should always be a priority. And that's something that I think really propelled me and allowed me to never worry about, I mean, I worked lots of jobs in my undergrad, but I was never in the position where I had to decide between an education and being able to support myself. And that's something that I'm really appreciative for. And then I also didn't have a lot of female supervision in my undergrad. And so now I have 2 female co-supervisors in my PhD, and I didn't realize what a difference it makes until now. I think that, I'm a relatively confident and extroverted person when it comes to talking about my research, but not having to insist that your ideas are valuable, just having it be, assumed that you should be listened to makes a big difference. I think I fought a lot to have my ideas heard when I was younger, especially being a younger woman as well. In natural resources, especially in some of the spheres I've worked, like in geology and forestry, some of the more established people in the field have a hard time accepting the ideas of the next generation early career researchers. And one thing I definitely wanted to talk about today that was specific to ecology was field safety. That's something that was never discussed when I was in my undergrad, and I did a lot of field work alone. That I feel like, I was always okay, but I think in the future I would definitely want to support it. In our current lab, we have done a lot of work recently and are doing more work to create policies for field safety and EDI and field work and issues specific to women and minorities in the field. So.
Thanks for sharing that. It's a really good point. We can talk more about fieldwork a little bit later. So Diane, I'll ask you now a little bit about your experience as a woman in STEM.
Right. Well, I guess I got a few, maybe two different perspectives. One is, as some of you know, my mother was one of the first women to get a PhD in the Department of Zoology, where I'm now a professor. So she had a really rough time. So this is, you know, the late 50s, 60s, 1960s. And even though she got a PhD, became a fisheries scientist, eventually she did leave science because, in part, she found it really challenging to juggle parenthood and a scientific career. So I had the perspective of knowing how much things have changed for women in STEM because of that, and because of the, you know, the cohort of scientists that were around my parents. The other perspective I have is from not just being a woman in STEM, but also from having researched it. So I have always, since I was a graduate student, been interested in gender and science, and I've been involved in some research projects looking at some of the issues. And you know, even though things are much better than for my mother's generation, you know, unfortunately, almost every metric you look at, women are disadvantaged as scientists. So, you know, if you look at the percentage, just the participation, so it drops off from, you know, it's equitable in graduate school. What totally depends on the discipline. But if, for example, in my discipline of ecology, it's even female biased in graduate school, but then it becomes male biased as postdocs, even more so as faculty. You know, look at publication, who's citing your publications. Men's publications get cited more, grant amounts, you know, and so on. So when you are a woman in STEM and you know these sorts of stats, you know, you're always kind of second guessing yourself of like, oh, did I not get that because it wasn't that good, or because I was a woman in STEM, you know? So, you know, there's this context that's around us, and you're never sure what happens, for what reason. I would say that there are some things that we can talk about maybe going forward in today's discussion, kind of instances where you realize that systematically, you know, you go to a conference and people assume that you are in a more junior position than you actually are, or that you must have had a more junior role in the project or the science than you actually did. So there's kind of concrete things that you see, but a lot of it is also the systemic things that you kind of need these big sample sizes to really be sure about.
Yes, thank you for showing that. Those are really good points. There's just jumping off just that, Natalie asks in the chat, so the second guessing and perhaps the imposter syndrome that comes up, how do you manage that?
Right, so I guess second guessing and imposter syndrome are kind of different things. They're almost in some ways opposite. So second guessing is there can always be another reason for why you don't achieve success, right? And imposter syndrome is like, when you achieve success, maybe you don't deserve it because you're an imposter. So in some ways they're flip. How do you deal with it? Well, you just get on with it, right? So imposter syndrome, like surround yourself with people whose opinions you trust to tell you if you're doing good science or not, right? And realize that, you know, academics probably are a group of people that are always feeling inadequate and lacking in self-confidence because the bar is so high. You know, you are always in a situation with amazing, thoughtful, brilliant people. So, you know, I think you just, your life as an academic gets a lot better if you stop seeing yourself in relation to all the brilliant people around you and think, oh, well, you know, they're much smarter than I am, and just kind of, you know, think, wow, this is so much fun. I really enjoy talking with these people. And yeah, I think that's how you stop all of the imposter syndrome stuff.
Fantastic. Jen, I was wondering if you wanted to add to that, or if you've had experience with either of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who has done any kind of, you know, university education even would be lying if they said they've never had second guessed themselves or had imposter syndrome. And I think that it's, you know, super prevalent at the graduate level. And that's also, you know, for a lot of people, the reason that they end up leaving the field is because they feel like they don't fit in or they're not good enough. And sometimes that's more of an indication of the culture than it is their actual work. And so for me, one of the things that I found most valuable through grad school is having a support network of peers that is diverse also, so that, you know, you have other women that you can talk to, and, you know, people are able to build these relationships so that when you second guess yourself, you have someone to say, you know, like, can you read this? Is it really that bad? Or, you know, I just get on with it, and am I still okay? Kind of thing. And that's been, you know, what's gotten me through a lot of failures to succeed, which there's a lot of failure in academia. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's a question in the comments from Nancy. I'll read it out loud, and I'll throw it out to both of you. She says, I think having more women in STEM can bring an advantage in broadening perspective. I wonder if either of you can think of any examples of male biases in how nature is interpreted in biology that a female perspective might not immediately go to. I sometimes see that outside of science, people commonly default to animals being male if they don't know what they're looking for or looking at and what is happening, even with maternal behaviors. So I was wondering if either of you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I guess I can jump in there. I think this is kind of an area that's really been explored in terms of animal behavior, because there's a lot of interpretation of what the behavior means, what its adaptive significance is, and there's some evidence that, you know, having that a male bias can lead to a narrowing of possibilities there in terms of interpretation. So I think the animal behavior, also called sociobiology, I think that area of ecology has really had to grapple with that.
I'll talk. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I can't think of any specific examples, but I guess I can just give a context that a lot of people in our lab work with Indigenous communities on cultural knowledge and reconstructions and relationship building. And I have noticed that in establishing those relationships, they take a lot of time and trust to develop and a lot of care for that kind of knowledge. And that's something that anybody can develop. But I think that if you come in with this attitude of I'm going to go in and get what I want out of this, as opposed to going in with like an open perception, the types of people who tend to be successful. Like we've had a lot of women in our lab who have developed successful relationships with Indigenous communities that are collaborative. And those are experiences that they've been able to share and teach how to build that kind of relationship with sometimes male colleagues that have a hard time kind of going to that as a default. Not to say that, you know, there aren't men that can go in and establish those relationships without that kind of support, but I have noticed a trend in that respect in terms of kind of relationship building and that aspect of doing science.
Oh, that's interesting. Thanks. Thanks for sharing, Jen. This is we've touched a little bit on just systemic barriers as well, and your gender response did make me think a little bit about just the experiences that minorities and women of color face in science as well. And this last year especially has been a year of thinking a lot about equity in all aspects of our lives. And Diane, I know that you co-authored a paper with Michelle Seng last year about minorities in biodiversity, and I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So the paper we wrote together was basically almost a note to our younger selves to say, this is what we maybe would have liked to have heard a few decades ago. Here are some strategies for when the going gets tough, how to get through it. A lot of areas of science are not only unbalanced in terms of gender, but also in terms of race. So in ecology and evolutionary biology, it is a predominantly white field. There is a real paucity of Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or BIPOC researchers in that area. So you're often just like the only one in a group. It's very easy to feel alone in those situations. I guess for context, in terms of all the ecology and evolution faculty members across Canada, probably the women of color, I could count on one hand. So, I think we'll probably hopefully talk a little bit about intersectionality. I have many identities, and being a woman is one of them. But it's almost impossible for me to extract that part of my identity, like in isolation from all the other parts. So, one experience I used to have a lot before I got such gray hair is I would go to a conference, and this is like into my 30s, and people would say, "Oh, hi, whose lab are you in?" And I'd be like, a tenured professor. And I felt like, this is because I'm a woman of color, like, because it happened over and over again. And it didn't happen to my white colleagues. It didn't happen to my male colleagues. That's the piece about intersectionality, that there are unique challenges from being a woman of color in science.
Yes, that's definitely true. I think there's enough challenges with just being a woman in STEM, and then the more layers of identity that you add on, becomes even more challenging and disheartening. There is a question from the chat. We will touch on intersectionality in a little bit, but maybe we can go to this first. So Andrea asks, can you speak to biases towards women with children in STEM? So maybe Diane, do you like to go?
Sure, I can talk to that because I got two kids who are in middle school right now. I think everybody who has had children kind of imagines before they have children that they will be like these super parents and that it will kind of like not really change their career trajectory at all. These added small beings in your life. So certainly I was somebody like that. And, you know, we had twins, so I was in for a very rude awakening. So there are suddenly a lot of constraints when you have kids. And the reason why we're talking about it now is still the labor of looking after kids in both physical and emotional ways is falling disproportionately still on women. So it becomes then a barrier for women in STEM. Some of the issues are, you know, I've already told you I'm a tropical ecologist, so I need to, normally I'd be traveling a lot. So I need to get to the field to like run experiments, help my grad students, those sorts of things. These are places that I generally can't bring my kids. Like often the field work is too dangerous. You know, we're in remote areas. There's tons of poisonous snakes, you know, driving ATVs down muddy tracks and hiking through the rainforest. Like the hazards are such that I can't bring my kids. So then I can only go away for certain periods of time because I can't leave my partner with the kids all the time. But and other colleagues, like they need to go to conferences to present their work. There's also travel. So there was a point where I noticed that, you know, other male researchers were continuing to travel a lot after they had kids, whereas I wasn't. I was like, okay, I have this 2-week field season, so I can't go to this conference because it would be too much in combination, right? I guess another thing that happens is once your kids get to school age and you start getting constrained around school drop-off and school pickup type times, then when career building events are scheduled outside of 9 to 3, 9 to 4, then it becomes a conflict. So I remember when I was on sabbatical in Australia and I was invited by the seminar organizer to give a research seminar, and it was at 4 p.m. And she said, I'm really sorry, but I won't be able to come to your seminar because it's at 4 p.m. and I have to pick up my kids from school. I was like, yeah, of course. But doesn't that happen every time you have a seminar? And she's like, yeah, I'm organizing the seminars, but I can't come to them this year. And it's like, well, why don't you just move the seminar time? Like, surely there's tons of people in your department who would benefit from this. So I think, you know, those are the sorts of systemic issues that make it really hard for parents in general, but unfortunately for a certain gender of parents in particular.
Thank you, Diane. Jen, I was wondering if you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have kids, so first off, say that. But I will say that I think one of the main drivers of the lack of retention of women in STEM from grad school onwards and also outside of academia is related to parenthood and, you know, the difficulties of family planning. Like I've had people tell me stories that they were denied transferring to a PhD because they looked around the age that they would want to have kids, and that's when people usually drop out. And I've heard lots of people being denied like mat leave or parental leave in different PhD programs, postdocs, et cetera, not being taken on for a postdoc because they were thinking about having children. And so I think that that's something that there still is not a lot of consideration for, particularly at that career phase. Like we don't talk about it a lot, but by the time you get a PhD, most people are usually in their late 20s or late 30s at least, right? So if you want to have kids, it has to happen at some point in that time period. And that's not something that's discussed when you're applying to these programs. It's like, what's your research going to be? Where are you going to live, et cetera? And so I think that that's a huge barrier and one of the large things that pushes people out of the field.
Awesome, thank you.
Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, you know, I participate in a lot of gender and science discussions, and, you know, it's important for people to understand that there's systemic barriers. And so that's often where we start the discussion. But I also want to not have everybody kind of leave today and think, oh, it's awful being a woman in science, or in particular, like being a woman faculty member. That sounds terrible. So what I would like you to know is, you know, whatever job you have, you are going to have these issues. And in fact, if you look at the private sector versus having a job in a university or in a government department, you know, the stats are worse. So if you, you know, this is actually better than it would be in some other sectors, employment sectors. So I would like to say that, you know, the flexibility that comes from working in a university setting is fantastic for being a parent. You know, I am sometimes able to like just change my schedule, like with, you know, with no notice. I have a sick kid at home and I'm able to sort it out. I'm able to, you know, arrange my field work a little bit around some of the constraints. So there's a lot of flexibility that is not in the private sector.
I appreciate you adding that. I think a lot of these are, you know, barriers that women face, you know, regardless of what kind of career they're in, and they're not just specific to STEM. So I appreciate you mentioning that. There was a question, Natalie was asking earlier, what can be done? I guess specifically about the barriers to women with children. And then also, does UBC have child support for student and staff? So maybe you can speak to that.
So the last question is easy. Yes, there is, but you know, like everywhere, there's a long waiting list. But yes, what can be done? So these are changing. So, for example, in my own department, we did have a discussion of seminar times that conflict with like parent responsibilities. And there's been a move to change seminar times to accommodate that. You know, when these things are pointed out, then there is action. So for example, if I keep going on about seminars, we realized that our seminar series was not representing the population of scientists that we could be inviting. You know, there were too many senior white males being invited. And so we enacted some policy changes to have a more balanced and inclusive seminar series. I mean, the thing with systemic problems is they are generally, they're not policy. They're there in plain sight, but it often takes a group of people pointing it out before we can get change. But often when they are pointed out, then we can move towards change. It's just that pointing out that sometimes takes a little while, and then figuring out the solution and getting there.
That's a really good point. And I imagine that must take a lot of emotional labor on the part of, you know, the women and minorities to do that, sort of pointing almost, you know, what is the word? Be perceived as perhaps like a nag by, you know, but you're trying to make things better. I just want to read out some of the comments from folks in the audience, and then we'll get to more questions. So from Facebook, Elaine says, so fortunate to have great experiences because of my field of work. My extended family continues to move scientific mountains. And Ildiko says, having worked most of my life in the private sector, agree with Diane regarding campus life, which is more open/flexible. In the private sector, it is extremely rare to have childcare support or tolerance of attending school-related events, etc. So thank you for mentioning that. Awesome. So we are at 1:45, so we'll do maybe about 5 to 7 more minutes. And I guess one thing I'm really curious about is, what are some changes that both of you would like to see? Like, what are your, yeah, I'll leave that as broad as that. So what do you think would make like a big impact? So maybe Jen, you can go first, and then Diane.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I guess it's difficult because the real issue is like how you feel on an everyday basis about, you know, your work environment and your colleagues. And it's not like one small thing that's going to make the difference, but the things that you can change are those one small things that you point out. And to me already, you know, I noticed a really big difference at UBC compared to where I did my undergrad in terms of like my lab culture and my colleagues. And so I think it has to start, you know, on the ground level of, you know, building within your work environment, like an inclusive environment, a culture of care, not just towards women, but minorities and different perspectives. And then leveraging that and also working at an institutional level to make some of those more policy related changes. And so I would say, you know, my lab environments are very inclusive, and I think that we, you know, do work very hard, and there's definitely things that we're still could be doing better on. But I do notice for some of my colleagues who are in different labs, they struggle a lot more, and they don't feel like they have female colleagues to talk with, or they feel like they're treated differently. And so I don't think that that's universal here at UBC. And I also think that in order to make those institutional changes, you can't be by yourself. You have to have other people working with you and supporting you.
Awesome, thank you. And Diane?
I think, you know, we often focus on participation rates, like what are the percentages of women or gender non-binary in science. But I think in order to affect participation, we have to think about other aspects, which include equity and inclusion. So Jen just talked about an inclusive working environment. So I think that's key. Like, this comes as a big package. You can't just work on one part of it. And I think the other thing is to think about the diversity of women's experiences. So particularly intersection with other aspects of identity around race, sexuality, gender identity, socioeconomic status, disabilities. So to think of the plurality of the experience of women in STEM, I think is the other thing that I would like kind of the conversation to change to, meaning the conversation like in the broader society. Yeah, I'm also, I think we're about out of time, but Jen wanted to say something about field work. And I was very curious to hear that.
Yes, I was saving that till after, but maybe we can do that.
Sure. Yeah. I guess it's something that I feel like has not been part of the conversation for a long time. And I have heard a lot of women discuss that, like, the scariest part of working in the field isn't like the snakes or the spiders or the bears, it's the strange men that come up to you, right? And that's something that I was never trained for, and I didn't know how to deal with the first time it happened or the second. Like, you just, you know, when some random old man comes up to you and asks you what you're doing and confronts you and tells you you shouldn't be doing it. Like, that's something that is going to happen inevitably. If you do field work enough, it will happen. And it's something that we should be training people for. And then there's also, lots of other issues related to field work specific to women in the field, like even using specific equipment that we haven't been trained to use, and it's just expected that we know how to use them, or related to, like, what do you do if there's no bathroom in the field, right? Like, things like that we aren't trained for, and we're just sent out there and expected to know how they work. And I think that, like, for us in our lab, we have a lot of women, we do a lot of field work, and we're working on developing a specific EDI policy and safety plan specific to field safety, not only when it comes to, like, using a chainsaw, but also with relating to other people in the field, and potential instances of harassment in the field, etc. And so I think that that's something that needs to be part of the conversation in all labs.
Thank you for bringing that up, Jen. I've heard that a lot from women who do field work. And I just want to add just to the intersectionality has been brought up a few times. I mean, last year, some of you might recall the incident in Central Park. Christian Cooper, who was a bird watcher, was harassed by a woman, and I believe she called 911, and it brought up this whole conversation of being BIPOC, but especially being Black, and being out in nature. And I think there's a lot of challenges in field work if you're not, I guess, a straight white man. Diane, I was wondering if you wanted to add anything to the topic of field work.
Yeah, so this is certainly something that's like evolving through time. Somebody asked me how things are changing in my lab, I guess. And when I started, it was basically, as Jen described, like go out in the field by yourself and hopefully you come back safe. So then it became, well, we have to be worried about our female graduate students going out alone. So there's almost a penalty for being female at that point, because they'd have to find you somebody to go with you in case of harassment, etc. And then, I think finally it's come out like, okay, actually nobody should be out in the field by themselves, right? And now that's departmental policy. Yeah, things have evolved. And I think for the better there, that it's now fairly widespread acceptance that you should not be in the field alone for all sorts of reasons. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think you briefly touched on this question from Natalie, but are you seeing changes in female and BIPOC students over time? So Diane.
Right, so representation-wise, yeah. So in the study that I did on the Ecology and Evolution faculty in Canada, like the percentage of faculty members in Canada in Ecology and Evolution is like a straight line going up over time. So representation is going up. We don't have comparable data really for BIPOC because the percentages are so low. So it's hard to conclude anything with such small percentages. But in terms of feeling empowered to speak out with concerns, I would say yes.
That's wonderful. That's really good news. We are really running out of time, so we'll have to wrap up very soon. I'm sorry if I've missed any of the questions, but if you have any last ones, you can put them in the chat. Oh, Natalie asks, anything parents of teenagers can do? I guess, do you mean to encourage them to pursue STEM? Whoever wants to take that. Diane, do you want to take that?
Oh gosh. Well, encourage them to keep all doors open, I guess, as they head into university. So I think both Jen and I had the experience of kind of coming to ecology later on in our undergraduate degree. And I was glad that I had left that door open. So I guess that would be my suggestion, like make sure they, as they go through high school, they can go any way in university with the subjects they're taking.
Fantastic. And Jen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, you know, when I was a teenager, I wasn't super aware of all of these barriers. And so the first time that I encountered them, I was really kind of struck in the face. You know, I kind of grew up thinking that, you know, women's suffrage happened and now everything was better. And then I kind of went into the working world and realized that was not the case. And I think education's also different now than it was, you know, when I was growing up. But I think particularly for teenagers, it's important for them to know what barriers exist and what they can do to make it, you know, a more level playing field for them on a daily basis. Like to know that if this happens to you, if you get rejected and you feel like it's for this reason, that you shouldn't give up the first time that happens, that you should keep going, and it happens to everybody. And more to think about how that you can change kind of your perception and the world around you to make those barriers better for people in the future.
Awesome. So I don't think we have any more questions for now, but maybe I'll ask one last question to both of you. If you had anything that you would have liked to say to a younger version of yourself, maybe when you were an undergrad or, you know, at any point when you were younger, what sort of advice would you give to yourself? So I guess we'll leave that as our last question. So Jen, maybe you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, advice to my younger self. I think I would have encouraged myself to focus more on building relationships with female mentors, because I personally have received a lot of value from that. And I think a lot of the discouragement that I had earlier on was because I lacked female mentors. And I won't even go into like that paper that came out and was retracted about female mentorship not leading to success based on co-authorship. But anyways, as somebody with very strong female mentors, that has been principal in my success as a female scientist. So I would have encouraged myself to do that sooner.
Wonderful. And Diane?
Yeah, I think it's really important when you embark on a career in science that you keep reminding yourself every day of why you love it. Because ultimately that's what's going to keep you in it. Yes, there's hurdles. We've talked about the hurdles all for the last 45 minutes, right? There's going to be challenges, but what makes it a joy is like this, you know, the spirit of discovery, the excitement of being out in nature, the wonderful people that you meet all around the world when you start collaborating as a scientist. So to focus on that is going to be your strength going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. That was so great and so informative. There's so many wonderful comments, lots of thank yous in the chat. Nicole says, I feel like even Naomi needed to hear that. So those are really important words. So thank you everybody for joining us. Sorry that we ran a little bit late, but you know, it's all good. Lots of good conversation. Nancy, is there anything you wanted to add before we start wrapping up? Oh, Nancy, you're muted.
Just wanted to see if anybody wanted to share a video and speak out loud or ask any questions out loud before we say goodbye, because we had been turning off all our video. So I think we're stopping.